say in South India, the Sultanate of Hyderabad, of Mysore, Tipu Sultan in Mysore was, I mean, he a heroic fighter against the British. Had Hyderabad, had Mysore, perhaps had they allied with the Marathas, there's no way the British could have conquered India. Um, so I would, and the moment that the sense of a united India came to be formed in the late 19th and 20th century, it became obvious to everyone that the Raj was going to end. I mean, even the most kind of dyed-in-the-wool imperialist had to accept the moment that there was a kind of Indian national consciousness emerging, there was no way that the British could hold on to India because the mismatch was too great.
I agree with Tom,
But
and I think that the reason India works, Tom, is because there had been empires in India, so it's perfectly plausible to imagine
yeah,
that in the 18, had history worked out differently, that there would have been some dominant empire in India that would easily have been able to see off the East India Company. Do you not think? I mean, but that's not the
yeah,
case with
completely.
other parts of the world. So that thing of all the colonial, I would say almost every single European colonial empire works because it works with local collaborators and local allies. And that starts right at the beginning when the Spaniards arrive in the Valley of Mexico, and then later
Yes.
on when they arrive in what's now Peru. So in both cases, the traditional view that we have is completely wrong. So the idea a tiny band of Spaniards pitch up and through their amazing technology and the fact that everybody thinks they're gods, they're able to overcome colossally superior numbers. I mean, that's just obviously nonsense. What happens is that in both cases, they're working with lots of local allies because the societies in which they've arrived are deeply fragmented and would always have been fragmented. So, the what we think of as the Aztecs, they have lots of local rivals. I think Tlaxcala are the most obvious ones that the Spaniards ally with, and the Spaniards are only able to defeat them because of their local allies. Same thing with the Incas. The Spaniards arrived, the Incas are divided, but they were probably always going to be divided because they had a history of division, and there were lots of people who resented the Incas. So that's slightly different from India, because I think in India hadn't you, Tom, kind of big,
Yeah.
powerful, rich, united civilizations that could easily have seen off European intruders. And I don't think that's true in the Americas. It's impossible to imagine, I think, the Native Americans of North America forming this massive confederation that would have seen off the French and the British. I mean, they had no history of such alliances.
No, but here's what's funny. They imitated exactly what you were talking about, right? They did it in reverse. So someone like Tecumseh, for example, tried to use the British to help him defeat the Americans in the same way that before there was a United States, certain tribes allied with the French or the British to try to see the other side. In other words, that's almost the reverse of what you're talking about, right?
But by that point, it's too late, isn't it?
It is too late.
But also, but also, I mean, I think technology does matter, and scale of size matters as well. But to go back to the technology, I mean, Dan, you were saying, why were people, I don't know, beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire not able to replicate the legions? Because they didn't have the society, the culture that had generated the legions. And likewise, if you're going through a kind of an industrial quantum leap, if you're going through the Industrial Revolution, if you are developing weapons that are fearsome and devastating on a scale beyond the imaginings of people who don't have factories, who don't have steel mills, and if you are a civilization that is able to feed vast numbers of people and generate a huge population growth, then there's no way you can resist it. And that essentially, going right the way back through the entire span of time, that's why we all now have urban civilizations and we're not hunter-gatherers, is because ultimately there are societal advances that will make certain societies stronger, more powerful, more devastating, more lethal than others. And when there is a total mismatch, those who are the weaker there's no way that they can withstand. So I would say that I'm sure that the Aztecs could have seen off the Spaniards, but I don't think that there was ever any prospect that the Native Americans of the Great Plains could have seen off the United States. I don't think that there was ever any prospect of the native people in Australia seeing off the settlers in the 19th and 20th century. There was just no way it would ever have been possible.
Okay, so I'll make this the last question, but it's certainly a trapdoor kind of question because it may. So one of the things you get here in the United States, and I think you get them all over the world, is this idea of that these technologically superior or I don't know what you would call it, a logistically, infrastructurally superior entities should not have done what they did, right? So for example, the people who came from Europe should not have done what they did in a broad sense. We're not talking about individual massacres or this, but in a broad sense, should not have done what they did. I find it in an almost I find it impossible to imagine the counterfactual in these situations when you have societies that are so dominating in terms of technological or as we said, logistical or infrastructural advantages. It's hard for me to imagine, for example, the Europeans finding the New World and then just saying, "Well, we're just going to sit aside and not do anything." I mean, in other words,
and let them have their gold. Let them keep their gold.
Continent.
Yes, this wonderful open land. When John Wayne once said it was okay for the Europeans to take the land from the natives because they weren't properly using it. I mean, is it one of those things where are we assuming something that almost would be a defying human nature to expect something like that to happen?
Well,
a trapdoor question emerges.
Tom, before you go, can I just...
You know what I'm going to say.
I know you're going to say it, and Tom will take a week to say it. So
That's okay. We have it.
Well, it's your podcast, Dan. I mean, the podcast
we have no time limits,
anyway.
obviously, if you've ever heard me.
So I would say, whenever people tell this story, and now Tom also knows what I'm going to say, and is probably rolling his eyes. I think whenever people tell this story and they start sort of, as it were, I don't want to sound like I'm a lunatic, but I will. When they start sort of wringing their hands and saying this is dreadful behavior, this is very awful, we should feel very sorry about it, all this kind of stuff, I just think that's ahistorical. I think people behave, in inverted commas, badly throughout history all the time.
Reliably.
Big, rich, technologically adept, aggressive societies will behave aggressively. I think it's impossible. I think it's literally impossible to imagine a scenario in which Columbus sails west, and then the Spanish don't do what they do in Mexico and Peru, for example. I mean, they don't all behave badly because they're all villains. They behave badly, I would say, because they're human, and because that's what people do. So I think the sort of expressions of slight shock that we have now as 21st century spectators looking at all this, which is sort of, oh, how could the Spanish do what they did? How could the British behave so meanly in India and Africa and all of this kind of stuff? We should feel very sorry and kind of rend our garments and weep and wail about it. I mean, again, I know some of your listeners will probably think I'm being too flippant, but I think the story of history is that this is part of being human. I mean, as awful as that may seem to many of us, and I know Tom will talk about why that seems awful to us and the sort of ideological sort of coaching we've had to think that. And of course, we all have that because we want to think of ourselves as nice people. But yeah, I completely agree with you, Dan. I think it's impossible to imagine a scenario in which Europeans can travel vast distances in great numbers with weapons, with firearms, with all of their diseases as well, by the way, and in which they don't subjugate these places. And I don't think it's because there's something intrinsically wicked about early modern Europeans. I think it's because, to be brutal about it, that kind of competitive, acquisitive, sort of exploitative strain is deep inside human nature, and it's an interesting aspect of being a 21st century Westerner that we shudder at that and we recoil from it, even as I think deep down we can see it in ourselves.
So Dan, what I would say to that is, was it bad? What is the definition of bad? What's the definition of good? What is wrong with going and conquering other people? What is wrong with if you're much more powerful, subjugating those who are weaker than you? And they may sound kind of shocking questions, but they're only shocking because we take the answer to those questions pretty much for granted. But if you look at the vast sweep of history, it's not at all self-evident that people regard, particularly in powerful and self-confident and aggressive civilizations, that they regard conquering people who are weaker than them as something that is quote unquote wrong. So going right the way back to the beginning, if you look at the Nama palette, which is kind of one of the foundational emblems of ancient Egypt, it shows the figure of a pharaoh combating the forces of chaos, and the images of people on that frieze who are not Egyptian, who lie beyond the borders of Egypt, makes it clear that they are the people who are the object of the pharaoh's wrath and might, and that their subjugation is the right thing to do, that this is a moral positive, that this is the correct thing to do. And it's very difficult to think of an empire um, in antiquity that did not see its conquests as in some way the expression of what either the gods wanted or kind of moral abstractions being worked out. So whether it's the Assyrians or the Babylonians, or indeed even the Israelites, their conquests are mandated by the divine. Um, Same with the Persians, but the Persians introduced this incredibly novel idea that the world is moral and that their empire is the expression of kind of an abstract force of truth and order that permeates itself throughout the entire fabric of the universe. And that's an inheritance that that Christians and Muslims have inherited. So the caliphate, the Arab conquests, they are justified by, this is what God wants. God wants the world to become Muslim. I think what makes the thing that is slightly more complex is the Christian attitude to this, because on the one hand, Christianity is a missionary religion that, like Islam, sees itself as a gift given to the whole of humanity, and therefore Christians, like Muslims, have a duty to spread their faith to the ends of the world. But what makes Christianity more ambivalent in its attitude to this kind of imperialism is the fact that Christ himself dies the victim of a great empire, namely the Romans. And of course, the cross is an emblem of the right of the powerful to torture to death the powerless. And this becomes the emblem of Christianity. It's the emblem that the Spaniards, for instance, take to the New World. So when the Spaniards conquer Mexico, of course, there is a sense of triumph. They are the conquistadores. The idea that God has given them this world and that it redounds to the glory of Spain, that it's something to celebrate. Of course, that is an element of it, but there is also a nagging sense that perhaps what they're doing is offensive to God, and it's really summed up with the kind of the great debate between two Spanish theologians, one of whom, Bartolome Las Casas, argues that the Indians have souls and that what the Spaniards are doing essentially is not justified by God's law. And his opponents, when they argue against this, have to draw on classical tradition to say, certain people are natural slaves. Of course, they should be conquered. And I think that ambivalence towards empire. So, if you're going out under the emblem of a cross, are you playing the Romans or are you playing the guy who gets tortured to death by the Romans? I think that is an ambivalence that has lain at the heart of the kind of the Western conquest of the world, the hegemony that the West has exercised over the world. And in a way, the fact that people beyond the West have bought into this, the fact that they too kind of buy into the idea that there is a kind of dignity in being oppressed, that victimhood brings its own status. Uh, The paradox is that in a way that is an expression of continuing Western hegemony. I mean, there's nothing really kind of more Western than the idea of decolonization, for instance. If you're decolonizing something, you are expressing deeply, deeply Western ideas. But it's a kind of massive, it's a kind of moral Mobius strip. Are these ideas inherently correct, or do we think that they're correct because we've all of us been weathered by the effects of empires that believed that and were kind of the vectors for it.
There's a
I
split the
wonder whether-
difference, though. There's a split the difference in this. I mean, if you like when I was when you go read the primary source materials from an era where people absolutely believed that there is eternal damnation and eternal hellfire if you're not saved by a religion. If you believe that your conquest of, say, a native peoples who are pagan or heathen or whatever word you would use, and because you have shown them the way, that you have saved them from an eternity in hellfire, then whatever you did to them in this one life is by comparison meaningless. In other words, how do good people justify this? I think that's how good people tell themselves that they've done a good deed by conquering and enslaving other people, as long as you saved them from an eternal damnation. Does that make sense?
But what is good? But what is good? I mean, that's the thing. What's the definition of good? Because your definition of goodness is constantly changing.
Oh, sure. Oh,
all right.
sure.
I mean, so I think the Aztecs, they were themselves imperialists. Their extraordinary city, their extraordinary civilization was itself founded on conquest. And as far as I know, there was no one in Aztec society that questioned that. There wasn't the kind of questioning of the right of the powerful to conquer the powerless that, say, the Spaniards brought, even though the paradox is that the Spaniards were infinitely more lethal and destructive.
I mean, I would say, Dan, I mean, I don't know whether Tom agrees with this. I just think asking the question, bad or good, is the wrong question to ask about history.
Well, unless you're a theologian.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, some of your listeners may well be thinking, well, what do you expect? You know, you get two British guys on and they're kind
That's
of making
right. That's right.
excuses for colonialism. But I mean, one way, if they think that, is to ask this. So some of the most effective conquests in history were the Arab conquests.
Yes.
And you know, here's a question. Were the Arabs wrong to conquer Egypt? Was that bad? I mean, if you went to Cairo today and you proposed that argument and you said this was a terrible thing, it was exploitative, it was aggressive, it was unprovoked, it shouldn't have happened, the people who did it were bad and they were villainous, and sure, they did it, they claimed they were doing it for religious reasons, but no doubt there was a lot of greed and cruelty and all this sort of stuff. I mean, if you made that argument in the center of Cairo, people would think you were demented. I mean, and I don't think, and most people, I think, would feel very uneasy making such an argument about the Arab conquests, because we tend to make those arguments about good and bad actually with relation to Western colonialism, don't we? And we think of colonialism as a purely Western phenomenon, as a European phenomenon. But I mean, imagine making that argument about the Ottoman Empire and saying the Ottomans were wrong to have conquered Constantinople. They were wrong to have taken Bosnia.
The Greeks certainly make that argument.
Well, the Greeks would make that argument, but then would you say the Greeks were wrong to have landed in Sicily and to have established their colony at Syracuse or something? I mean, that would seem crazy argument to make.
You know my answer to that. I mean, good, right and wrong, good and evil are cultural constructs.
Of course they are.
Generally,
I agree with you.
Generally are propagated by the powerful, and the ideas of good and evil, or right or wrong, or justified invasion or whatever, are generally created to sustain structures that have been created by the powerful. Because if they're not powerful, then they don't last.
Well, I mean, in the United States, you could say if we have a problem with the invasion of the Spaniards into the New World, for example, and they come in, I mean, the Comanches had a genocidal war against the Plains Apaches. But that is beyond the pale of the sort of ethical discussions we have about this sort of stuff, because these are indigenous peoples against other indigenous peoples. In other words, it's like Gallic tribes fighting other Gallic tribes, and then Caesar comes in. Is there any difference between having an outsider?
Now your argument is who are outside. No, but surely your argument here is who are outside. I mean, how far are you allowed to travel to fight? Surely that's it. Because let's take the example of the Aztecs. The Aztecs were not indigenous to the Valley of Mexico. They had moved south. So is it okay for them to move by land, but not okay for the Spaniards to move by sea? I mean, I think the trouble is these are, when you start to look into those sort of moral boundaries, I think, just begin to crumble. I mean, I don't think you can say it's fine for the Aztecs to come to trudge overland and then start fighting people. But because the Spaniards have come by ship and have paler skins, that's not
Well,
okay.
so unless you're a theologian, as a historian, I think you have to regard morality as relative, as culturally conditioned, as something that evolves and changes. In other words, not as something absolute. Because if you're treating it as something absolute, then you're engaging in a slightly different discipline. I think it isn't to say that discipline is wrong. I mean, that's what theology and philosophy and ethics is all about. But if you're looking at history, to talk about ideas of right and wrong as absolutes, you have to recognize that the sense of these as absolutes is culturally conditioned. So to look at the Gauls, was it wrong for the Romans to conquer the Gauls? I mean, to the Romans, no, and probably not to the Gauls either, because the Gauls had sacked Rome. The Gauls were constantly rampaging around. They were tribes. They were endlessly attacking each other. The Romans conquered them, and the Gauls ended up kind of acknowledging the Romans as the most powerful tribe of all. And that was kind of part of the moral universe that both Romans and Gauls in the 1st century BC inhabited. If we look now, say the question you asked, can white Americans sit in judgment and say that, say, the Comanches were wrong to attack other Native American peoples in the Great Plains? Inherent in that is the idea that because Native Americans ended up being conquered and subdued and subordinated to the power of the white settlers, therefore they have a status as victims that white settler society privileges, because that white settler society brings with it the idea that its God suffered the death of a slave at the hands of an imperial power. And even if people, particularly on the liberal wing and progressive wing in the United States, are no longer overtly Christian, they're not denominationally Christian, morally in their hearts they remain Christian, and they retain the conviction that there is a status and a moral value in being a victim that being a victimizer, being an imperial power, does not possess, and that therefore people who come from a position of privilege are not entitled to sit in judgment over those who are not privileged. But that is a culturally conditioned assumption that is bred of the distinctive character of American history, I would argue. I mean, you could go further and say, well, that is an absolute moral position. But if you're doing that, you're no longer engaging in history, in my opinion. You're engaging in philosophy or theology.
And for more on this, Tom Holland's book Dominion would
Oh, thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. That's very sweet.
Gentlemen, I could continue this all day, but it's about 115 degrees in my studio right now, and I am melting. Where can people hear your podcast?
So it's called The Rest is History. You can hear it on Spotify, you can hear it on iTunes, and you can hear it on YouTube. And we do 2 episodes. We pretty much do 2 episodes every week, don't we, Tom?
Yeah, sometimes a few more.
Covering everything. They're much, I have to say, compared with Dan's, your opuses. I mean, these are mere pamphlets. Some of them are only 45 or
that's a
50
great,
minutes.
That is a great way to rationalize my lack of productivity. Thank you. I appreciate that.
But no, it's we do 2 a week, and we have a club called the Rest is History Club. And if you join the club, you can have chats with all the other club members, and they all get very excited, don't they, Tom? Basically, they do. Yes, they basically spend most of their time telling us how terrible our most recent episode was, or whatever. Yeah, so it's the Rest is History. It's not as hardcore as hardcore history, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Tom?
I think it's less epic and sweet, but we are kind of inspired by you, Dan. We're upping our game. So we've just done a 5-part special on the American Civil War, and you may be appalled at the idea that we could possibly do the American Civil War in 5 episodes. but when we tell you that we did the whole French Revolution in I think about an hour.
Oh my gosh! Okay,
you'll see that we're doing better.
Okay, well, you guys are delightful. I'd love to have another conversation with you someday. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
My thanks to Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook for coming on the program today. Their podcast, The Rest is History, is something you should absolutely check out if you haven't already. It's been a long, hot summer full of challenges in the family stuff and everything else. So it's been a while since we've spoken to you. Thank you for your patience. I know many of you've had similar summers, but I feel back in the saddle again. So we should have some offerings on tap for you before too long. And, if I don't talk to you until then, well, remember, we have a Twitter feed at Hardcore History. Maybe you can hear from me in the interim. And I hope you're all having a good summer and a good year. And here's to hoping that things pick up and get better, as the end of the year rolls around. It's